The ancestral Puebloans built forgotten monuments aligned to celestial cycles. Chaco Canyon's sprawling network coordinated 150 communities without written language. Stone daggers of sunlight still mark their astronomical precision today. Not near the center, not close to the center, the exact center. And it has done this, within minutes of solar noon, for approximately 1,000 years. This is Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico. In the year 1100 CE, this place was the engineered center of a civilization spanning 60,000 square miles. At that same moment, London held approximately 10,000 to 15,000 people, while the Chaco regional system alone linked an estimated 150 communities across the Colorado Plateau. The people who built it are called the Ancestral Puebloans, and their descendants are alive today. The 19 Pueblos of New Mexico, the Hopi Nation, and the Navajo Nation all maintain documented ancestral connections to this canyon. This video is about the science, the measurements, the peer-reviewed data, the engineering numbers, because the data is extraordinary, and most people have never seen it. Let us start with a single building and a single number, 0.2 degrees. That is the margin of error in the alignment of Pueblo Bonito's northeast corner to summer solstice sunrise. Not 2 degrees, not 1 degree, 0.2 degrees. Pueblo Bonito contains approximately 650 rooms and stands up to 4 stories tall. It covers roughly 2 acres the floor space of a large regional convention center. At that scale, 0.2 degrees of angular precision equals approximately 30 centimeters of placement accuracy. 30 centimeters. The width of a human hand. The ancestral Puebloan architects placed the corner of a 650-room building to within the width of a human hand of the solstice sunrise azimuth, without telescopes, without metal tools, without written trigonometry tables. This precision was documented by researcher Anna Sofer and the Solstice Project through repeated instrumental measurement between 1978 and the 1990s. Her findings were published in peer-reviewed archaeoastronomy literature. They have been in the scientific record since 1979. The question of whether Chaco's builders tracked the sky is not a hypothesis. It is a documented measurement. Construction at Pueblo Bonito began around 850 CE, nearly 3 centuries before 1100. The building was not put up in one season or one generation. It was built in planned, phased campaigns across approximately 300 years. 300 years of builders working from the same astronomical design intent. The architects who laid the final stones had never met the architects who staked the first walls. Yet the northeast corner of the final building lands within 30 centimeters of the original astronomical target. That is not accident. That is a transmitted science. Tree ring dating dendrochronology has produced more than 5,000 dated wood specimens from Chaco Canyon structures alone. That makes Chaco one of the most precisely dated prehistoric sites anywhere in North America, per the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. We know when each beam was cut. We know which mountain range it came from. The construction timeline is not estimated. It is measured. And what the timeline shows is a civilization building toward astronomical precision over centuries deliberately. Now, before we go deeper into the alignments, let us establish the physical scale of what was built here. The great houses of Chaco required the transport of more than 200,000 ponderosa pine timbers. Each timber averaged over 600 pounds. They were moved 50 to 80 miles through mountain terrain, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals. Think of it this way. 600 pounds is the cargo weight of a fully loaded pickup truck bed. Moving 200,000 of those loads by human effort alone, across mountain terrain, 200,000 times. The road network connecting all of this spans more than 400 miles. 400 miles longer than the distance from Washington, D.C. to Boston. Every segment of that road is precisely 30 feet wide, engineered with raised curbs and cut ramps. The roads run in straight lines for up to 30 miles at a stretch, cutting directly through terrain. They were surveyed by aerial photography and ground verified in the Chaco Roads Project, documented by Niles and colleagues in 1987 for the Bureau of Land Management. 30 feet wide, 400 miles, built without metal tools. The scale of Chaco is not a footnote, it is an engineering story of the first order, and embedded in every dimension of that engineering is the sky. The sun moves predictably. It rises at its northernmost point on the summer solstice, its southernmost on the winter solstice. Those azimuths, the compass bearings of sunrise and sunset, are fixed by latitude and do not change. An architect who knows those bearings can encode them permanently in masonry. But the sun is the easy part. The moon is where the complexity begins. The moon's rise and set positions on the horizon vary on a cycle of 18.6 years. At the cycle's peak, called the major lunar standstill, the moon rises and sets at its most extreme northern and southern positions. Then it pulls back toward the center. Then it swings to the extreme again, every 18.6 years. Tracking this cycle requires multi-generational observation. You cannot observe one complete standstill in a single lifetime of astronomy. You must inherit records. You must pass records forward. You must trust those records across time. And at Chaco, the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle is encoded in the architecture of Pueblo Bonito itself. Pueblo Bonito is shaped like a capital D, a long straight-back wall, and a curved front. The diagonal axis, running corner to corner across the D shape, aligns precisely with the moonrise azimuth at major lunar standstill. This is documented in measurements published by Anna Sofer, Rolf Sinclair, and L.E. Doggett in the journal Archaeoastronomy, supplement to the Journal for the History of Astronomy, in 1982. The 18.6-year cycle is not incidentally present in the geometry. Sofer's analysis indicates it is the organizing geometry of the building's entire D-shaped form. The architects held an 18-year astronomical cycle in their design intent across multiple generations of builders and expressed it in the proportions of a 650-room structure. 18 years is longer than a modern United States presidential term, longer than most people hold a single job. The ancestral Puebloan architects built that time scale into load-bearing masonry. But what happened on Fajada Butte, that part, changes how you understand everything else. Fajada Butte rises about 135 meters above the canyon floor at the south entrance to Chaco. Near its top, 3 large sandstone slabs lean against the cliff face, each weighing several tons. Behind them, carved into the cliff, are 2 spiral petroglyphs. On June 29, 1977, researcher Anna Sofer climbed to the site and witnessed what happened at solar noon. A thin blade of sunlight slipped through a gap between 2 of the slabs and moved slowly across the larger spiral. It entered from the top. It descended through the center. It bisected the spiral exactly. Sofer and her colleague Volker Ponting returned repeatedly over the following 2 years, measuring the light-shadow interactions at solstices and equinoxes with instruments. Here is what the measurements showed. At summer solstice noon, 1 dagger of light bisects the center of the larger spiral. At winter solstice, 2 daggers frame the larger spiral symmetrically, 1 on each side. At the spring and fall equinoxes, a dagger of light bisects the smaller spiral precisely. 4 solar events, 4 distinct and measurable light interactions, 1 petroglyph site. The precision is documented to within minutes of the actual solar event. Not hours, not days, minutes. The 3 sandstone slabs were not placed randomly against the cliff. They were placed to function as a light-channeling instrument. Each slab weighs several tons. Moving them into their current positions required deliberate, coordinated effort. The spirals behind the slabs were carved to receive the light in precisely the positions where the light would fall. This is the Sun Dagger site. It is one of the most precisely documented solar marking instruments in the pre-Columbian Americas. Sofer published the initial findings in the journal Science in 1979. That is, 45 years of peer-reviewed literature on this single site. The Sun Dagger is not the only solar instrument at Chaco. It is one node in a canyon-wide system. Consider Casa Rinconada, the largest isolated kiva at Chaco, approximately 63 feet in diameter. Its north-south axis is aligned within 0.5 degrees of true north. A floor niche in the kiva wall catches a direct beam of sunlight at summer solstice sunrise, documented by archaeologist R. Gwyn Vivian and National Park Service researchers. The kiva is both a ceremonial space and an astronomical instrument, oriented to within half a degree of cardinal north without a magnetic compass. Now consider Wijiji, one of the later great houses, constructed approximately 1100 to 1115 CE. Its long axis is oriented so that the corners target the winter solstice sunrise azimuth, documented by SOFAR's solstice project measurements. So the picture forming is this: 9 great houses, multiple kivas, a butte-top petroglyph site, and a 400-mile road network. Each element is independently measured and independently documented to carry astronomical alignment. The question is no longer whether the system is real. The question is how it functioned as a system. What were these buildings doing together? What signal was the entire canyon broadcasting? Think of it this way. Chaco's great houses function like a GPS satellite network built in stone. Each building is precisely positioned so that when sunlight or moonlight strikes the architecture at a specific moment, it broadcasts a calendrical signal, not to machines, to the entire agricultural and ceremonial network of communities tuned to watch for it. 150 outlier communities, spread across 60,000 square miles, watching the same canyon. When the Sundagger found its center on Fajada Butte, everyone in the network knew the solstice had arrived. The architecture was the broadcast infrastructure, the sky was the signal, the communities were the receivers. Now let us go deeper into the specific measurements, because the numbers are where this becomes undeniable. SOFAR's solstice project measured the alignments of 9 Chaco great houses against the solar and lunar azimuths, calculable for Chaco's latitude. The results, published in SOFAR's 2008 volume, from Museum of New Mexico Press, show a consistent pattern. The buildings are not randomly oriented. Their primary axes and diagonals cluster around 4 specific azimuths: summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunrise, major lunar standstill moonrise, major lunar standstill moonset. 4 azimuths, 9 buildings. The clustering is statistically non-random. It cannot be explained by terrain, prevailing winds, or construction convenience. The only variable that explains the clustering is intentional astronomical orientation. Let us walk through the intersite geometry, because this is where the system becomes visible. Pueblo Alto sits on the canyon mesa top, north of the canyon floor. A staircase cut directly into the cliff face connects Pueblo Alto to Pueblo Bonito below. The placement of Pueblo Alto creates a north-south sightline to Sin Kletzen on the South Mesa, 1,760 meters away. That intersite axis tracks the meridian sun, the sun at its highest point of daily transit, directly south. 2 buildings, 1 sightline, 1,760 meters of precision across a canyon oriented to the meridian. The sandstone grit under your boots, warm from a noon sun that has just crossed exactly overhead directly between those 2 buildings. Researchers mapped the entire complex simultaneously to reveal the intersite geometric relationships. When you plot all 9 great houses on a single map and draw their primary alignments, the sightlines intersect, parallel, and complement each other. The canyon itself is the instrument. The buildings are the calibration points. Now let us talk about what was recovered from inside these buildings, because the material record tells its own story. Archaeologists have recovered more than 200,000 pieces of turquoise from excavated Chaco Great House assemblages. 200,000 pieces from a single canyon complex in a desert region with no local turquoise deposits. Isotope analysis by researchers Garmin Harbottle and Phil Wigand, published in Scientific American in 1992, traced the material's source. The turquoise came from mines near present-day Cerrillos, New Mexico, approximately 180 miles southeast of Chaco Canyon. 180 miles, carried overland, without draft animals or wheeled transport. 200,000 pieces represent an enormous volume of long-distance exchange. Chaco was not self-contained. It was the hub of a regional economy, moving high-value material across hundreds of miles of the Colorado Plateau. The road network was not ceremonial decoration. It was functional infrastructure for that exchange system. 30 feet wide, curbed, ramped, running straight for 30 miles at a time. This is engineered logistics, not a walking path. And then there is the sky event of 1054 CE. On July 4th of that year, a star in the constellation Taurus exploded a supernova, visible in daylight, for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded it. Arab astronomers recorded it. That supernova is now visible to us as the Crab Nebula. At Chaco, near Penasco Blanco, a pictograph exists on a cliff wall showing a crescent moon, a bright star, and a handprint. Researchers John Brandt and Ray Williamson, writing in the Archaeoastronomy supplement to the Journal for the History of Astronomy in 1979, analyzed the configuration. The crescent moon's orientation and the star's position relative to it are consistent with the sky's actual configuration on the night of July 4, 1054. An ancestral Puebloan astronomer at Chaco watched a star explode and recorded its position on a canyon wall. The handprint beside it, that detail, has stayed in the published record for 45 years without resolution. Someone was there. Someone pressed a hand to the wall. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore the drought data and what it tells us about what Chaco actually was. Beginning around 1130 CE, a prolonged drought gripped the region. Tree ring records from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona document the drought in annual resolution. By approximately 1140, construction at Chaco's great houses had effectively ceased. And by 1150, the ancestral Puebloan populations had begun organized migration northward and eastward, away from the canyon. Here is the word that does not belong in this story: collapse. The ancestral Puebloans did not collapse. They did not vanish. They did not mysteriously disappear. Pueblo oral histories describe the departure from Chaco as a purposeful ancestral journey, a deliberate relocation, not a failure. The distinction matters, because collapse is a framing choice, not an archaeological finding. The tree ring data shows drought. The archaeological record shows cessation of construction and population movement. It does not show social disintegration, warfare-driven dispersal, or cultural rupture. What it shows is a society that read an environmental signal the same way they read the sky and responded with organized, purposeful action. Rena Swentsel, a scholar and architect from Santa Clara, Pueblo, stated it directly in records held by the National Park Service. She said, "The Pueblo people did not abandon Chaco. We did not vanish. We walked away from a place that had served its purpose, and we carried everything that mattered with us. Everything that mattered. What they carried was knowledge astronomical, architectural, agricultural, ceremonial. That knowledge is present today in living Pueblo communities. It did not end at Chaco. The 19 Pueblos of New Mexico, the Hopi Nation, and the Navajo Nation maintain active, documented cultural relationships to this canyon. Portions of the astronomical knowledge embedded in Chaco's architecture parallel living ceremonial practices that Pueblo communities have not placed in the public record. This video covers only what researchers and Pueblo community members have explicitly shared publicly, and that alone is remarkable. Now let us return to the engineering precision, because there is one more layer of data we have not addressed. The 18.6-year lunar standstill is encoded not just in Pueblo Bonito's overall geometry, but in specific wall spacings at Casa Rinconada. Sofaer and colleagues documented that certain wall-to-wall dimensions at Casa Rinconada correspond to the angular measurements of the major lunar standstill moonrise and moonset azimuths for Chaco's latitude. The kiva is not just oriented to cardinal north. Its internal geometry references the moon's extreme positions on the horizon. This is the detail that separates Chaco from a site with a few convenient alignments. The astronomical encoding is multi-layered, present in overall building orientation, in diagonal axes, in internal wall spacing, and in intersite sightlines, simultaneously. Each layer of encoding was independently verified through separate measurement campaigns. The methodology used by Sofaer's Solstice project is straightforward. Calculate the theoretical azimuth for each solar and lunar event at Chaco's latitude and longitude. Then measure the actual orientation of each architectural feature with a surveying instrument, and compute the difference. Repeat the measurement across multiple seasons to verify against atmospheric refraction and horizon elevation corrections. The results have been independently reviewed by archaeoastronomers, including Rolf Sinclair, and published in refereed literature. The measurements are not contested. What has been debated is their interpretation, whether the alignments were consciously intended or emerge from other cultural practices. But the measurements themselves are stable. 0.2 degrees is 0.2 degrees. That precision, achieved in sandstone masonry, without metal instruments, without trigonometric tables as we understand them, is the core finding, and it has been sitting in peer-reviewed journals since 1979. Which brings us to the question that matters as much as the astronomy itself. Why isn't this in your textbook? Not as a rhetorical question, as a real one. The data exists. It has existed for decades. It is peer-reviewed and repeatedly verified. Its absence from standard educational curricula is not an evidentiary problem. It is a historiographic choice, a choice about whose engineering achievements get taught as engineering achievements. The same precision-based astronomical architecture that fills textbooks when attributed to Stonehenge or ancient Egyptian temples is absent from most curricula when its address is northwestern New Mexico. The science does not differ. The documentation does not differ. The precision does not differ. The variable is the civilization doing the building. Sit with that. UNESCO recognized the site in 1987, designating Chaco Culture National Historical Park as a World Heritage Site. The citation specifically names the astronomical alignments of the great houses as a defining feature of universal value. Universal value. That is the international scientific community's assessment of what Chaco represents. The ancestral Puebloan architects who built this system belong in the history of science, not in the history of mystery. They were not primitive builders who happened to face a building toward a sunrise. They were precision engineers who encoded multi-generational astronomical observation into load-bearing masonry at sub-degree accuracy. The evidence distinguishing those two descriptions is in the published literature. It has been there for 4.5 decades. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, the part about what happens when a living civilization is standing on top of a measured ancient one. In 2022, the Biden administration formally withdrew approximately 336,000 acres surrounding Chaco Canyon from new oil and gas leasing. The withdrawal period is 20 years, and it followed years of sustained advocacy by the All Pueblo Council of Governors. The All Pueblo Council represents all 19 pueblos of New Mexico, the documented descendants of the people who built what we have been measuring. Their position was clear. The integrity of the Chaco landscape, the dark sky above it, the undrilled ground beneath it, is inseparable from the significance of the site. The fight over Chaco's integrity is active, not historical. It is happening on a policy timeline that extends into 2042, and Pueblo nations are the primary decision-making voices in that fight as the cultural and ancestral authorities on this landscape. This is not a site that belongs to the past. It belongs to a living political and cultural present. The science of Chaco and the sovereignty of Pueblo nations are not separate conversations. They are the same conversation. Understanding the precision of Chaco's astronomical engineering is the prerequisite for understanding why its protection matters at the policy level. You cannot argue for a site's protection without understanding what the site is. And what the site is, what the measurements tell us, is a functioning astronomical observatory at regional scale, built in stone, still legible to instruments today. 9 great houses with measurable astronomical alignments to solar and lunar events. 0.2 degrees of precision at Pueblo Bonito's northeast corner for summer solstice sunrise. The 18.6-year lunar standstill encoded in Pueblo Bonito's D-shaped diagonal axis. The sundagger on Fajada Butte marking all 4 key solar events with subminute precision across approximately 1,000 years. Casa Rinconada aligned within 0.5 degrees of true north with a solstice-catching floor niche. Wajiji oriented to winter solstice, sunrise, at its corners. Pueblo Alto and Sin Kletzen forming a 1,760-meter meridian sightline across the canyon. More than 5,000 dendrochronologically dated wood specimens, establishing the construction timeline in annual resolution. More than 200,000 pieces of turquoise sourced by isotope analysis to mines 180 miles away. a 400-mile road network, precisely 30 feet wide, verified by aerial survey and ground truth. A possible supernova record from 1054 CE on a canyon wall above Penasco Blanco. Each of these data points came from a separate research team, using a separate methodology. Each has been independently published. Each has survived peer review. Together, they describe a civilization that treated the sky as infrastructure, as essential to its function, as roads and walls. The dry desert air of Chaco, cold at night, even in summer, carries sound oddly far across the canyon floor when nothing else is moving. You can stand at the base of Pueblo Bonito at dusk and hear a conversation happening near Casa Rinconada, a quarter-mile away, carried on still air, as if from the next room. The people who built this place knew that too. They knew the acoustics the way they knew the azimuths. The 18.6-year lunar standstill cannot be observed in a single lifetime of watching. It has to be handed down generation to generation the way a master builder hands a plumb line to an apprentice and says, "Hold this level and trust what it tells you." The ancestral Puebloan answer was to carve the cycle into stone at a scale no one could misread. Not a note, not a table of numbers, a building the size of a regional convention center pointing at the moon's extreme rising position on the horizon. The knowledge was the architecture. The architecture was the memory. And that memory is still intact, still measurable by instruments today, because living Pueblo communities protected this landscape long enough for the instruments to arrive. Rena Swensel's words carry forward here. They carried everything that mattered with them. The 19 Pueblos, the Hopi Nation, and the Navajo Nation are not footnotes to Chaco's story. They are its continuation. The living line between the architect who placed that northeast corner within 30 centimeters of the solstice and the governor who stood before the federal government in 2022 and said, "This ground is not for sale." The sun dagger still finds its center on the solstice. The measurements still hold. The line from 1100 CE to today is unbroken. The 19 Pueblos, the Hopi Nation, and the Navajo Nation are not footnotes to Chaco's story. They are its continuation. The living line between the architect who placed that northeast corner within 30 centimeters of the solstice and the governor who stood before the federal government in 2022 said, "This ground is not for sale." The sun dagger still finds its center on the solstice. The measurements still hold. The line from 1100 CE to today is unbroken. And what the site is, what the measurements tell us, is a functioning astronomical observatory at regional scale. Built in stone, still legible to instruments today. Let us do one final pass through the data, because the cumulative picture is what makes the case. Carries sound oddly far across the canyon floor when nothing else is moving. The scale of the astronomy, however, requires pausing on the human problem it represents. How do you teach a cycle that lasts longer than a human memory? The 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle cannot